Hey you! Yes, you! Welcome back to Would Be Productions' new interview series highlighting Minnesotan filmmaker Peter Hurd and his film The Control Group. Last week we learned about Peter Hurd's inspiration for The Control Group, and today we're going to dive into casting a low-budget movie in Minnesota, as well as where and how you can find talent. Oh, and is it a good idea to direct your own movie and produce it? Let's see what Peter has to say.
So there's a lot of production activity, obviously, in LA and New York, and more in places like Atlanta, Toronto now. So there's a lot of production going on there, but there's quite a bit going on in Minnesota, more than you would think of. Not so much feature films. I mean, there's a good number of feature films, a couple every year, but a lot of commercials, things like that. Things that don't immediately spring to mind when you're thinking about film production, but there's still a lot of crew members here, a lot of actors, a lot of people who know what they're doing. So in some ways, it's better, it's easier to make a first feature in a market like this because there's not as much competition. Like, every crew member, everybody wants to work on feature films. If you're offered 5 jobs and one's a commercial, one's a photo shoot, one's a TV episode, one's a web series, and one's a feature film, almost everyone's going to choose the feature film. I mean, it generally pays better because it's a longer shoot. It's usually less per day, but it's a lot more days, so it just adds up to more. But then it's also more just what you want to do when you're an actor or a crew member. It's a bigger credit. It gets your name out there. Adding commercials to your resume doesn't add as much as even a single well-known independent feature film. So in some ways, it's a little easier to get crew members here. And I can't speak across the board, but I know some things are cheaper here just because there aren't as many productions competing for resources. Flip side of that is that there's just not as many resources. There's not as many crew members that are experienced, and there's not as many people living here, so it's not as much of a guarantee that you'll have the right people available during your production dates. So pros and cons both ways, but it is, I think, ultimately a little easier to make something here for a first feature. Craigslist, surprisingly, is a very popular way to hire crew for film and TV, and that's where we got a lot of people. There's a couple job hiring sites that are aimed exclusively at film crew, Production Hub, a couple others, and I found that usually once you post a job on one of these job sites, it will somehow magically end up on all the others. I'm not quite sure how that is, but it was a very common experience for me. Once you put the job out there, it came. And you really don't need to do, for hiring crew, you don't need to do that much looking. There are a lot of crew members out there. There's a good number here. There's infinitely more across the country, and there's a lot less independent production than there used to be. So there are a lot of people willing to fly out. I mean, I got a lot of experienced crew members flying out from LA for a pretty low budget movie, and they're still available. So there's people out there. We flew in some crew members from LA, a handful of department heads, and about half the cast from LA as well, and some from New Mexico, just from online auditions. But that just comes from posting jobs online and seeing who fits it best. And if there isn't someone here who's right for the job and who's available and who just clicks with the rest of the production, then you can fly them in. And we were somewhat lucky in that department because we were a location shoot even in Minnesota. We were shooting in Fergus Falls, which is 3 hours out of the Twin Cities. So everyone's staying at a hotel. We have to pay everyone for a transportation day, like basically just a day to get there and get set up. A day that we're not shooting, basically. So it didn't really make that much of a difference budget-wise to fly people in. Really, the only difference is their ticket. And since we only flew in a handful of people, it's not that big. You still have the travel day. You still have to put them up in a hotel. So you just have to pay for a flight. So if there's not the right crew members here, you can fly them in. A lot of the hiring for the crew is not through the director or the producer. A lot of it is through the production manager, the assistant director, the cinematographer. Obviously, the department heads hire the people under them. As the producer, you have to get a hair and makeup head, but then they hire the hair and makeup artists. So a lot of that in-person hiring just came from them. So it was people the department heads had already worked with before that they brought in. Only a handful of people for the biggest roles, cinematographer, production manager, assistant director. That was the roles I was meeting with people and focusing on. And then they were mostly hiring the people in their departments. As the director, I was the sole producer, which essentially made me the line producer and executive producer as well. I hired a casting director, but I was there with her for a lot of the casting meetings, so I was kind of halfway the casting director as well. I was involved in the writing. I mean, obviously as producer and director, you're always involved in the writing. You're involved in everything, but as far as specific jobs, it was producing, directing, and then working with the writer. So yeah, producing and directing, it's crazy. I wouldn't recommend doing it for any indie filmmaker unless you have absolutely no other choice. And for me, I wanted to get this movie done. I had an opportunity to make it, and I didn't really know anyone else who was experienced in making these kinds of films. And I did talk to other producers around Minnesota because I originally wanted to find someone to do more of the business end while I just focused on the story and the direction. And I couldn't find anyone that I really clicked with that I was going to trust to do the production. So I ended up just doing it myself out of lack of other choices. But it's definitely not ideal in the future. I would want to hire a producer, find a producer or studio to handle the production side of things. I mean, I do like being involved in that, but after a certain point, it does take you away from directing and focusing on the movie, essentially. Yes, the cast was entirely under the Screen Actors Guild, that actors union. That was necessary once we had Brad Dourif. He's a SAG member. Every actor you've heard of is a SAG member, and their union rules are very restrictive. You really can't, global rule 1 is what they call it for the Screen Actors Guild, which is that once you're a Screen Actors Guild member, you do not work on non-guild productions. So if you want to name actor, you're gonna have to be SAG signatory, which sucks because it is a big pain to do it. It's a huge process. It's going to add to your budget. But again, if you want any name actors, you're going to have to do it.
Thanks for tuning in. Come back next week to learn about production and safety on set.